Speak Easy Studios. Speak and be heard.
Yo, this is Stephen Lee.
And I'm Frank Jackson.
And we are the Distinguished Critics. We're here to break down some of our favorite albums and songs and debate what's overrated, underrated, and everything in between. So join us as we go back and relive some of music's most iconic projects. Give us a listen wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and give us those 5 stars. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of This or That. I'm Stephen Lee, as always, joined by Frank Jackson, and today we are going to be discussing 2 sophomore albums from 2 hip-hop heavyweights. That's right, we're talking about DMX's Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, and Jay-Z's In My Lifetime Volume 1. Frank, how you doing today, sir?
Good, man. Ready to get into it.
DMX, Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, released on December 22nd, 1998. Jay-Z's In My Lifetime Volume 1, released on November 4th, 1997. So both of these albums came out roughly within a year of each other, but could not be more opposite. You got Jay, who has always been more of the smooth, hustler, slick wordplay type of MC, whereas DMX, who emerged in 1998, at least nationally, kind of brought it back to the streets when hip-hop was in a real pop type of phase with the Diana Ross samples and all of the 80s and 70s classics being flipped by Bad Boy. DMX was able to pull really the roots of hip-hop and kind of bring it back there on a commercial level. So, where were you? Let me rephrase it. When was the first time you remember hearing both of these projects?
Well, X is just someone that, so I have an older cousin who was like a DMX fanatic, from like day one. I was exposed to DMX before Jay-Z. So X, most of my life, really like I heard this album since I was, before 10 years old. I heard this pretty much when it came out. As far as Jay, I got into Jay-Z a lot more come probably early high school years. I started to, care a little bit more about Jay-Z and go back, listen to his earlier catalog. But to your point, this was kind of an awkward time in hip-hop, right? We had just lost Big and Pac, and the game needed someone badly. And then, even when Big was here, it was really only 2 things, right? You had either the flashy, glossy appeal of Bad Boy, shiny suits, and, like you said, the Diana Ross samples, and then on the other end of that spectrum, you had Death Row and everything that they were, right? Which was just hardcore to the street type thing.
G-funk, gangster rap, traditional,
correct.
Yeah.
So there was a void. Now there was a void. And sort of in between the time when Big passed in 97, in between the time when Big passed and when DMX dropped, there was kind of nobody who took over at all.
At
like
least in
Jay,
New York.
including
Right,
Jay.
right.
Jay didn't really take over anything. It was just a void there left for somebody to kind of hop in and take it. And these 2 slotted into very different spots, but blew up to, that same level of, even though early on, you could say it was even more so for X. X dropped 2 albums that went number 1 in the same year, 6 months apart.
Yeah.
So,
you know the story behind that, by the way?
About him being offered the bonus
to
drop it. Yeah.
Basically like, hey, if you can record another album by the 4th quarter of 98, because his debut came out in May of 98, I think he was incentivized, like, I don't know if it was $2-3 million, whatever it may be. But yeah, he went in there. These are not leftover tracks from It's Dark and Hell is Hot or anything that he had been sitting on. Because even on It's Dark and Hell is Hot, you have a song, a single rather, like Get At Me Dog. And a lot of those rhymes, like, if you go back and you research DMX now, like, he had dropped these in various freestyles, actually kind of going at Tupac before, but like we had heard this material, some of it before.
Which used to be common in hip-hop.
Right.
Somebody would drop something, and then when they actually release their album, it could be literally 2 or 3 years later, you'd find that verse
somewhere.
Like Nas dropping Halftime, 2 years before
I
Illmatic
think on
came
like the
out.
Jungle Fever soundtrack
Yeah,
or something. It
way
was one of
before,
those soundtracks,
years
right?
before, and that used to be common.
Yeah, so he pumped this album out. Really, I think in like 2 or 3 weeks, he went and recorded it. Swiss Beats handles 60% of the production here. Like he's definitely sliding into that role as like Rough Riders' main in-house producer.
Right.
Obviously, you have like Damon Grease and people like that, but Swizz was kind of planting his flag with like DMX's brand, and these two are kind of a package deal. And Jay, to your point earlier, Jay was in a weird spot where he drops his debut in the summer of '96, Reasonable Doubt we're talking about. And a lot of people love to go with the revisionist history that Jay has always kind of been this commercial monster and always been viewed in that upper echelon. When Reasonable Doubt came out, it took a while for that to even push gold. He wasn't touching Biggie's numbers. He wasn't touching Pac's numbers, certainly. He was kind of just like, oh, okay, this guy's nice.
I mean, let's be honest. He was just a guy.
He was just a guy.
He had potential.
Right. He was more of like, if you had like your favorite rapper's favorite rapper discussion back then, people would be like, yo, Jay is nice, but just commercially it wasn't moving like that. And after he dropped that project with Priority Records, that was supposed to be the only album. That was like the one Jay-Z album. He was going to focus on Rockefeller with Dame and Biggs and kind of just make this more of a label thing, and they'll sign new acts. Obviously, they later did that with like Beanie Siegel and State Property and all of them, but that was Jay's vision. So when Big dies in March of '97, you really do have this gap, like you said, where it's kind of like, all right, Nas is dicking around with this Firm project, and it wasn't good, right? At least in terms of expectations.
Absolutely not.
And Jay felt like, okay, I'm going to step up here and kind of claim the throne of New York City.
Which I'm glad you say that, because one thing that people noticed in real time, and if you do some research on it, you'll see Jay kind of his I guess you could call it a slip up in a way, though understandable. Jay really was pushing that kind of hard after Big passed. He was kind of like, the people have to elect you
to have that King of New York crown.
He was strongly kind of trying to throw himself as that.
Yeah.
And it felt forced, and people felt that at the time, which was, I would say, Jay's kind of only misstep in his whole thing. But again, it's understandable, right? Because back then, hip-hop in New York was everything. If you were big in New York, you were big
everywhere, yeah.
Right? So to be the king of New York meant to be the king of hip-hop. And so Jay pushed very strongly for that role, which obviously the problems with him and Nas, that was one of the main things that was at the center of it, which was, Nas is like, you're the king since when? And on this album, he was always
shots.
A fan.
Yeah.
He was always a fan of Nas, and you could tell based on, he sampled Nas a lot, like not even as some sort of insult type thing. Like, he really was just a fan of Nas. You got to keep in mind, Nas had success long before Jay did.
Well, at this time, Nas is, still kind of riding off It Was Written, his sophomore album, and that went triple platinum.
Right.
So if anybody were to be a king of New York, so to speak,
it would have been Nas.
Even though, a lot of people, not to get too far off subject, a lot of people didn't really like It Was Written at the time. I feel like they felt it went a little too commercial with the Trackmasters and If I Ruled the World and all that. But yeah, Jay did kind of step into this and kind of put the crown on his own head. He wasn't anointed by the people, so to speak, or the hip-hop purists. You could see that he had talent, but again, on this album, he had a single, The City Is Mine, and he even says that. He's like, on the low, shh, the city is mine.
Right.
And to any other New York MC, and there were plenty of formidable ones around that time, it is kind of like, all right, my antenna's up here. This guy's assuming just because Biggie was his man that he's going to step into this spot and just be that.
And in retrospect, one of the best things he could have done, right? Like, I'm glad he tried to force that. It brought out the hunger of a lot of people. It made the competition that much stronger. I think it brought out
the hunger in Jay.
It did. Oh, it absolutely brought out the hunger in Jay, because if you're gonna put that crown on yourself, well, now you gotta go prove it. And
right.
I'm glad he recognized that. Like, if I'm gonna claim to be this, I actually have to go be this.
So
And,
you want to go ahead and start with this album then? I mean, we're already
Yeah,
kind of getting into the makings of it. So again, yeah, Reasonable Doubt supposed to be the one album deal. It's on Priority Records. He actually inks a deal with Def Jam in 1997, and Rockefeller will be housed there. They'll be under the Def Jam umbrella. Now, keep in mind, Def Jam in late 97 is not the Def Jam that you would think of in the early 2000s or in the 80s or anything close to that. They had hit a real rut. I believe Warren G was like their biggest selling artist a few years before. They were struggling.
He was.
So Jay, obviously with Big's passing and having inked this deal, says, okay, well, I'm gonna start putting out some albums here, and I'm gonna push this King of New York thing subtly in some cases and overtly in others, and that's what we're getting with In My Lifetime Volume 1. So in researching this project for today's discussion, like what are your main takeaways from this album?
So this was Jay's. He, in more than one way, tried to force things, right? There was one way that we just spoke of where, he was kind of putting that crown on himself. The other way that he was forcing things was, this is before Jay developed himself into that natural hit maker.
Mm-hmm.
And this album had a handful of songs on it that were very pop-like and
very
objectively
bad boy.
Just not good.
Right.
Like they were just not good and didn't really mesh with the rest of the album.
Right.
It's almost like every 3 or 4 songs he would throw one of these sort of pop anthems on there and say, like, that's the one that's going to be.
This is the one where he's reaching for radio play.
Right. This is the, I want this to be the crossover success song. And, I think he went over on those. It didn't feel natural, which is crazy to say, right? Because in hindsight, I mean, look at Jay-Z's career. He's made hit after hit after hit after hit after hit. But not everyone, almost no one, starts off with that ability.
Right.
We're talking about very few people. Like Big was one. Big kind of quickly was just able to do that. There's very few people.
Even Pac did it in unconventional ways.
Yes.
He did it from a way where
but it wasn't like pop hits. It was like, this shit is just so different and real.
Right.
And
Brenda's Got a Baby.
Exactly.
And all those.
Exactly. Stuff like Brenda's Got a Baby. It wasn't like a pop hit, but it's like, oh, nobody's doing this.
Right.
This is, some sort of mixture of like Chuck D and KRS and Cube and all these different artists who are super conscious, but that's what made his turn into those hits, because it spoke to a different level within people, right? Yeah. It was speaking to that ugly shit that nobody talks about. But when you're talking about the pop stuff, it's hard. It's not, obviously, it's not easy to make like a crossover hip hop pop hit. And Jay was trying hard on this album to do it.
He was reaching so hard. I'm glad you mentioned that it feels a little disjointed, because that's exactly what it is.
Right.
I think for every there are songs on this album where you from Streets is Watching, Friend or Foe 98, Imaginary Player, that, honestly, you could kind of hold up against any of Jay's songs in any time period and say, no, he's on one here. He's firing on all cylinders. But for every, 2 of those songs, the sandwiched, puffy handprints all over it, Teddy Riley type of feel, would find its way in the album. It's only 14 songs, but there are at least 3 or 4 that come to mind where it's like, man, you're forcing this. Always Be My Sunshine, and I Know What Girls Like. I Know What Girls Like might be the worst Jay-Z single I've ever heard. I like Show Me What You Got more than this. And if you see the videos for these songs too, dude, he's got lime green suits on, and you got the Rubik's Cube disco dance floor, and it's like, bro, you would think he was on Bad Boy. And obviously he's cool with them. He showed up on Mace's album and Puffy's album.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he tried to you can't be
truly,
the king of New York and slide yourself into that.
It was truly awful. The only one, the best of those, I would say is probably The City Is Mine.
Right.
And because that one didn't feel so much like, to me, there's a difference between kind of I'm trying to make a pop hit, and I just have a song and an R&B group is doing the chorus on it.
Yeah.
That's not quite the same
Blackstreet,
thing to
right?
me. That was Blackstreet.
Yeah.
That's not some of his best work, but it's also not.
It's not a horrible song.
It's not horrible.
But again, it's a chorus that Blackstreet's singing that's lifted from like an 80s pop record.
Yes.
And it still doesn't sound like it's not a horrible record. Like, again,
it's
I know
still
what
in the
girls
category
like,
of force.
but it doesn't feel as seamless as what he was able to do later on, or really just a year later with, Hard Knock Life and Big Pimpin' and all these records.
Right after that, he
Took the
nailed
game
it,
over,
right?
yeah.
He nailed it. Now on this same album, you juxtapose those, let's be honest, terrible songs with imaginary players, with Streets is Watching, Friend or Foe. In my opinion, the two songs that in this album, Where I'm From and You Must Love Me, that is putting on display what Jay's true talent and ability really is. Like, Jay is, one of, I don't care how you want to do it, one of the 5 or one of the 10, or it really depends on what era.
He's in that stratosphere, that
whatever
category.
your list of like greatest are, of just being able to put together a rhyme structure with the content and the flow and make it all feel so effortless.
Right.
I would say he's probably the best at that after Big. I think Big is the best ever at that, of just, this feels so effortless.
It feels
like
almost
it's like water.
like freestylish almost,
Yeah,
where it's
it's
kind of
just
like
flow-
it's
it's free
so
flowing.
breezy. And Wayne mastered that later on, but certainly Jay and Big were like the first, at least in my opinion, that were
Agreed.
able to do that. Now I know some of the older listeners might look at like a Slick Rick.
Oh, of course.
Or,
They might even look at a Kane, a Big Daddy Kane,
something
or
like that
Rakim.
in terms of painting the picture,
course.
but like Jay-Z did it with like a feel that it's all off the top of the dome, and obviously we know he doesn't write his material, so I think that leans into that as well. But this album, I think if you had stripped it down to like 11 or 12 songs, or maybe replace one of those singles, I think you're looking at like a top 3 Jay-Z album. And
at least sniffing that.
I mean, Jay has never been known for like the introspective cuts. Like, obviously years later, 444, he dove into the whole personal expedition and all that, but he has never been, I'm going to bare my soul on a record. But even this album has at least like 2 of those for me. Like Lucky Me, I feel like is very smooth, and he's kind of opening up a little bit, and then You Must Love Me is the other one.
Which, even for You Must Love Me, it was that thing that, let's be honest, most rappers do. They're telling somebody else's story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine, right? Because this is just, it's for the
art form.
And it's for the voiceless, right? To have their stories told on a wide scale. So I don't know if I would even call that introspective so much as it's his view of what's happening around him, what he grew up with, and he's telling stories from what he grew up with. But to your point, he's never really been so much that guy. Jay talks about himself a lot on records, right? But it's never quite letting you in. It's just more.
Yeah.
It's just more, this is what I do. Is, he's talking himself up, and he's really good at.
He's probably the best of all time in that regard.
At that, right? Just literally Jay could kind of tell these other artists, like, I'm better than you on a song, and they'll still be like, I love that shit.
Yeah.
Right? Because, like, he's so good at it. And like you said, probably the best ever at just talking himself up. But it's not like he's letting you in that much. And, 444 was probably, not even probably, I would say it's the first time where we really got, like, a
peek
extended look inside.
Yeah.
It took him growing up quite a bit, right? But, yeah, those 2 songs I would say are the closest thing to that, where he really is in a, Jay-Z is a poet, but he's not always, his thing isn't quite street poet. Those are, on this album, those songs that's street poetry.
Right.
Like, this is me with a ground level view of what's happening. This is Marcy. This is
you're talking about this particular album?
Yes, on this album.
He still had that type of feel to his records before he was the 40/40 Club and the conglomerate that he was bragging about. Yeah.
So I would say this album is disjointed, but from your perspective, does the good outweigh the bad? Because this is really a case of kind of two extremes, right? Because my God, Sunshine is one extreme,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, You Must Love Me, Where I'm From.
Or even like Who You With, where it's like that to me, if he was gonna go with like the bouncy, like jiggy style of '98, like that's it. It's not I Know What Girls Like. It's like do a record like Who You With. Like that's more of like where you're not quite forcing it and it still comes across as like an effortless kind of single that you can bob your head to.
And even if it's a miss to me, it's not like that is just like cartoonishly bad.
I'm sorry. What was your question though? It was more or less like does
the good on this album outweigh those misses,
Right.
those swings and misses that he took on here?
I'm gonna say emphatically yes. Personally, and I am like you to where like I didn't get into Jay in high school. It was a little bit before that. I would say it was probably around middle school when he's dropping Blueprint 2, the Black album. But just going back,
like at that point, the singles I loved, but even then, I wasn't diving in to high school.
Yeah, and just going back and revisiting his catalog, and now having 20 years of listening to him consistently and having dove through every one of his projects, I definitely think the good outweighs the bad on this. I think that this album, when people talk about Jay's classics, like your Blueprint, Reasonable Doubt, the Black Album, it's not quite there, but I personally still have it as a top 5 Jay-Z album. I'd probably fall somewhere between 4 and 6, or 4 and 5, I'd say, because 444 is up there. That's a project that I really liked. But In My Lifetime, Volume 1 isn't. I do think it's better than Volume 2, Hard Knock Life. That's the one where he was able to sell 5 million albums and really put him on the map. But I think a closer listen would show that there's a lot of gems on this album, and it kind of went overlooked because of how bad those singles were. We talked about the King of New York thing earlier, and obviously, if you're listening to this, you're a hip-hop head to some extent, so you know about Jay's beef with Mobb Deep and really Prodigy in particular. A lot of that kind of started on this album, too. I mean, he has a line where he says, I'm from you and your man's rap about every verse in your rhymes, because on the infamous, Prodigy had a line about jetting through Marcy, and Prodigy even came back years later and said, hey, I heard that, and that kind of started some tension. Jay is the master. Him and Big are the master at taking pot shots at you, and you're sitting there wondering,
was that about me?
Was he taking a shot there?
Yeah, they are.
And he did that kind of all throughout the album. And even though he sampled Nas again, we're not talking about Dead Presidents. We're talking about Rap Game, Crack Game.
Right.
He's still kind of taking shots at Nas too.
Yeah.
While in the same breath, again on this project, paying homage to him. Who's the best MCs? Biggie, Jay-Z, and Nas. But he's kind of putting his chest out there enough to see if anybody will bite. And again, I look at this album and I think that you have 8 to 10 incredible records and just a few that are so far on the opposite end that it might dilute the project to some, but I love it.
So I would say to some extent it saves the album that really some of his best work is on this album. And I will say he needed those misses on this album, right? Because how do you know what to do next
What works
time?
versus what doesn't. Yeah.
Exactly, right? It's trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
I think if those songs had worked, we might have had a much lazier Jay-Z who was like, oh, I could just do this shit.
You could ride out the Mace formula.
Just take, take this sample. I'm going to go out here. I'm going to go get a R&B singing chick up in here.
Yeah.
And boom, we just pump out a whole album of this shit. And then here you go.
There it is.
Eat it up.
Yeah.
5 million albums.
Yeah. Yeah, this only sold 1 million copies. So,
Right.
a lot of people associate Jay with, he's quintuple platinum. He sold 3 on this, 4 on another. Again, it did better than Reasonable Doubt, but it did not put him to most.
Well, and in retrospect, I mean, it's laughable to even compare the two because it's not. A Reasonable Doubt is more, and this is why I feel this way. I'm not certain that it saves the album. Reason being, I don't like it's simple. I don't like to have to hit the skip button too many times.
Right.
I feel like
you want it to flow, especially at 14 songs. You should be able to pop that in and just
That's
let
the
it
thing.
ride.
If you have 14 songs and 4 of them, I'm like, what is this shit?
It weighs
like,
heavier.
It does. It's a great album. It's not touching the category of classic to me.
Okay.
But there's numerous classic Jay-Z songs.
If you're making a greatest hits album,
exactly.
like you have to throw
I'm
some of
put
these
at least 3 or
the
4
album
of these
cuts
songs on there.
Yeah. I think I think you said it best. I wouldn't call it a classic. I think it's a precursor to some of the classics that he was able to drop years later. Again, trial and error, figuring out what works and what doesn't. I would put this probably in the Hall of Very Good category, where I think it's super slept on. And I think that a lot of people should go back and revisit this for reasons mentioned.
100%.
But I can't say because, again, 14 songs and you got 4 or 5 of them where you're like, no, I'm good on that. I can't put it in the category as a reasonable doubt or even the blueprint.
Agreed. So is there a song on here that most resonated with you?
Resonated. I mean, I guess it really depends on what you're looking for in a Jay-Z album. Like, again, you're not getting a Tupac level message from any of these songs. But one that stands out to me that I'll just always love is Where You From. It's that dark, grimy, New York feel. It doesn't sound dated. I mean, every verse is just Jay-Z in his peak form. I thought it was one of the better ways to end the album, that and You Must Love Me. But it's hard for me to even pick between that and like Imaginary Player, because I think that's Jay-Z at like his smoothest. So I would say my 2 favorite cuts from the album are probably Imaginary Player and Where You From.
I 100% agree that on Imaginary Players, that's when you have Jay just putting on display that like effortless kind of buoyancy that he has on records. I think You Must Love Me is probably my favorite of. I mean, it's one of my favorite Jay songs. Just period.
Yeah.
Because it's just so real, and again, like that's kind of a rare thing that you get from Jay-Z. For better or worse, you know what you're gonna get from Jay, and
this was a step outside of that to you.
This was very much a step outside.
But it still worked.
That was the closest thing I say to something that Pac would have made, or Nas would have made, or somebody else, not Jay-Z. Right. It was really that kind of ugly look into the other side of things. You know, like a lot of this shit gets glamorized, right?
Oh, Jay does a lot of that throughout this album and really his entire career. So giving you the flip side is a change of pace.
They'll give you that kind of Tony Montana side of like, yeah, I'm out here with the cars, I got the luxury, whatever. You know, like all of that flashy shit, all of what, you know, the money brings in. But Jay doesn't do a lot of talking about that other side, like I had to sell crack to my mom type shit.
Yeah.
And on this album,
it offers a glimpse
into the other shit, right? So I would say that's probably my favorite track on this album.
Okay. You want to move over to DMX?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood. Again, as we touched on at the top of the show, this was his second album of 1998, and it can't be overstated just how important DMX was for hip-hop and really even remains that. I think that for the first time since Pac's demise, you had a lot of rappers still pushing the gangster rap. I mean, West Side Connection was still heavy on that. Obviously, No Limit was blowing up at the time. But DMX, again, New York was viewed as the Mecca at that time. A lot of people probably screaming right now, it's still the Mecca. What are you talking about? But, I mean, it really was. Like, you had to go if Funk Flex was playing your record, you were on to something. And for DMX to come out the way he did, the gravelly voice, the raw emotion, and he's still making really big records. He put it together for a classic debut album, and It's Dark and Hell is Hot. Like, again, it can't be overstated just how important he was to the game.
And for Def Jam, right?
Yeah, he saved Def Jam.
He saved
I'm glad you mentioned
label. That. X came at the perfect time, and it wasn't quite planned that he was gonna bring it back like that. Is more than they could have ever imagined, right? Um, X was another one who filled the void at a kind of an awkward time because sure Jay-Z was starting to bubble more, but he was feeling more.
Yeah, Jay didn't save Def Jam
No,
with the album that we were just
no,
talking about. That's for
absolutely
sure.
not, right?
So I am glad you mentioned
And
that.
if anything, he was going to be stepping into sort of that Big and Puff side of things,
Right.
not as like the gangster dude. X was a far cry from that.
Right.
X was like, it felt like he was rapping with a razor blade in his mouth.
Yeah.
Like he was really that like
And a pit bull in the studio.
pit
in the
bull
booth,
right
yeah.
next to him, right? Like X was just hardcore direct to the street. He was something that, like you said, there was the gangster music out there still, but New York needed that
DMX,
guy.
yeah, they needed
New York
they
needed that
the,
guy.
the raw, the gritty, like he's gonna pull up on the block type of MC.
And he's bringing it from somewhere. Him and the Locks are bringing it from somewhere that people knew about Brooklyn, they knew about Queens, and y'all. This is Yonkers.
Yeah,
this is a place nobody even heard of.
Yeah,
this is a place nobody even heard of.
Yeah, as somebody that had to stay in Yonkers when I first moved to New York, it is not New York City, and that's no knock on YO, but it's like when you imagine New York City, YO is north of that, and it's just not the same.
Right. And I mean, they're bringing real hardcore street music, like all the way back, right? And so, like we talked about, so this is X's second album, and usually that means like, oh, somebody made something, went back to the lab, a couple years later, dropped something else. This was X's second album in 6 months.
Yeah.
And they both hit number one. They were both smashes, and it has to be stated, X put so much like expectations on himself, no pun intended, I guess, that he he didn't want to put less tracks on this follow-up than he had on the first album because he felt like he would be cutting the people short. So he released 2 lengthy albums in a year, within a year span, really within a half a year span. This had 16 tracks on it. The first one had 19, but who's going to complain about 16, right? Like,
right.
It had less than the first one, but he was really out here pumping out. And like you said, these were original tracks. This isn't like recycled shit like, oh, I just had this.
Yeah.
I had this, this was on the cutting room floor.
A quick cash label grab where maybe they're issuing like a bunch of B-sides or stuff that never left the studio.
Exactly.
Yeah, this album was, okay, you want me to, and he was so hot at the time, and I feel like because DMX was, he was in Unsigned Hype in The Source back in like 91, 92.
Very early 90s.
So the fact that it took him, 7 years to get to this point, it's like, okay.
I'm glad you said that. This was in the making for, he had been working towards this for a long time.
Right. So like him going back to do this second album, he still had all that same natural energy. Like, okay, I'm not going to half-ass this. If you're giving me this money to do this project, I'm going to make it one of the best in my entire catalog. And a lot of it does feel like It's Dark and Hell is Hot. A lot of it doesn't to me, right? Because I feel like on It's Dark and Hell is Hot, you had a little bit more of like production-wise, at least, that gritty classic New York sound, and DMX was, I don't want to say reserved, but it was a little bit more subdued by Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, and he's, bellies out, and there's no bigger artist than DMX at this point.
Yeah.
It was he's going to marry himself with the Swizz Beats production. Swizz, again, handled like 60% of the beats on this album, but the intensity is, at least in my opinion, stepped up a notch.
Right. And, with Swizz doing, the majority of this project, his production style is just more bouncy, which is it's funny. It's a funny contrast to X's subject matter, right? It doesn't feel like, what X's content feels like it should have some sort of like horrorcore, like synthy type of production to it.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And there's a little bit of that on one song here, or maybe 1 or 2 songs here.
Yes, there's a very little bit of it. But it worked, right? Even though Swizz had this production style that didn't quite, in my estimation, match what X was talking about on these songs and how he delivered it, it still found a way to mesh. Although I will state for the record right now, I've never been a fan of Swiss, and I'm just not a fan of his production. I get it. Salute, he's considered somewhat of a producing legend in that rap game.
He is a legend by definition, but yeah, let's address the elephant in the room. Like, I would say 80% of Swiss Beats production, I'm just not fucking with.
And that's, people might not like that. I'm sure New York people certainly won't, but it is what it is, right? Not everything's for everybody. I can't help but feel like if X did have it's hard, right? Because on some of these songs, they wouldn't be what they were if they didn't have Swiss's production. I feel like a lot of them, though, if they had a different type of production, might have been better.
I feel like DMX's catalog as a whole, and again, Swizz has produced some huge hits for X, but like when you're getting deeper into this album, again, it is 16 songs. I think the album tops out at over an hour. A lot of it just sounds dated to me. And, maybe back in late 98, early 99, it was fresh. I don't think I would have liked it then. I certainly am not the biggest fan of it now. I think what anchors this album is purely DMX and the features that he was able to secure, from the Lox and from Jay-Z, even Mary J. Blige showing up. But I would say Swizz's involvement, or at least contribution, rather, to this project is kind of what holds it back a little bit for me in terms of being that bona fide.
It's a footnote to me.
Right.
It's a footnote. And this is to X's credit. X carried the hell out of this album. Like, it almost didn't matter what beat you put on it because he's so good, right? And the Lox are so good.
That was just a perfect
to have
connection.
Jada and Styles as people that are just like, oh yeah, I got these dudes too. Like, we're talking about these are three of the best MCs of all time. Just like, hey, we blew in from Yonkers real quick. And, this is the move. And I'd be remiss that I mentioned Sheik as well. Like, yeah. I don't want to be disrespectful.
Sheik held a lot of those songs down.
I don't want to say the Lox and not mention him.
I think where Sheik, just real quick, kind of gets not discussed as much as just he never put out like the solo records or never had like the scene stealing guest verse on maybe somebody else's project the way Styles or Jada were able to do.
Right. So, as we get into the album, one thing that I will say is it does, and in part because it is mostly produced by the same person, this album does feel cohesive. There are a couple of songs that I feel like maybe don't quite fit sonically, but content-wise, what he's saying, like the subject matter throughout this album, this is all X really giving you. I'll say this, even though this isn't my favorite DMX album, this is the most DMX album that there is, if that makes sense. Like, this is the things he's talking about and the way he let you in, because he really let you into his psyche, mind state, his brain, his surroundings, struggles, everything he came up with. He exposed all of himself on this album. And, X was an interesting cat because he really was like that grimy dude that people didn't want it with, but nobody talked about like love more than DMX did. Nobody was really out here praying on albums the way X was. Such a nuanced, complicated dude, man, on so many different levels. And wasn't nobody really out here saying shit like, dudes had this kind of thing about them where it's like, man, I ain't gonna talk about loving no dude. Like, man, X ain't have no problem with that. Like, X is on this album talking about, like, if you love me, I love you type shit. Yeah, like, talking about his homies. Like, it's that kind of thing. And then even if you look at, obviously now, unfortunately, rest in peace, X, there's a lot of things, where people who knew him best will talk about him and how he was. And that's something that was really big for X. Like,
He
That's
showed
how
it
he
on
was
his
in his
records.
personal life, and he showed it on his records,
Yeah.
right? Like, love was something that was huge to him, and that loyalty and love from, and he had no problem bearing his soul. That, I would say, more than any rapper I can think of in the history of the game, that more than Pac, more than
Right.
anyone. I think X bared his soul more than any MC that there's ever been.
I agree, and I think that even you mentioning Pac, it's like when DMX came out with these projects in '98, I do think people looked at that vulnerability, and it reminded a lot of people of what Tupac was able to give you. But to take it a step further, I would agree with that. I think that in terms of just being so naturally comfortable with who you are, including your weaknesses and your struggles, and bearing all of that, it like there is no one greater at that than DMX. And it made you feel like you knew him, or you could relate to something that he went through. You don't have to be the hardest cat from Yonkers or anything to really relate to a lot of what DMX is saying. It should be, known that if you haven't listened to this project and you're going into it expecting a Rough Riders anthem or a What's My Name or a Party Up or a Who We Be, this is the album that doesn't really have any of those monster singles. The main single on this album is Slippin', and personally, it's my favorite. It might even be it's my favorite DMX single. I say that confidently.
It might even be my way now. Agreed.
It might even be my favorite DMX song of all time.
In stark contrast to what we were just talking about with Jay, and how he's not that really introspective until the 444 album. You want to talk about introspective? Slipping is like, oh, I'm gonna let you know it all. Like the dude really sat there and had a therapy session on a piece of paper, and all of that kind of X let you in on everything. Like, this is all the pain. This is like
and
why, and he had a lot of it, and this is where all of it came from. He even on that song, talked about the drug problem,
yeah. They edited
X wasn't
the
they
version
did block it, but
they
you can
blocked
tell.
it, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because even if you were to buy the explicit version of this LP, Slippin' is an edited song, and I think that this probably went over a lot of people's heads back in the 90s. Obviously, we found out about his addiction struggles in the early to mid 2000s, but he has a line where he's like, I hit rock bottom. People like, damn, look at how that rock got him. I mean, he really opening up, and I think that I don't know if he intended to do this, but what's so brilliant about that record and it being on this album too is he had so much momentum and so much hype based on the first project that maybe he felt like he didn't need one of those big-time Rough Rider anthems and said, okay, this is going to sell no matter what. We're in the fourth quarter of the year. This is when people buy albums. I'm the hottest rapper in the game. I could put out a single like this and show my versatility, and people are still going to buy it. The album sold 3 million records. So
Right. And, it really is just one of those things where he was riding a wave, a crazy wave that nobody could have saw coming. Not him, not Def Jam. If anybody, it would have been him. But, I mean, he's been honest about that. Like, not even he did, right? Nobody could have really saw it coming. And to the point of what we were talking about before, people who kind of immediately are making, like, just know how to make a hit. X on his first album, on It's Dark and Hell, I mean, that's Rough Riders anthem. You still hear that shit today.
Every stadium, they're going to play it.
X came out the gate with some hits already.
Yeah.
And on this album, I do think, to your point, that probably made him a little bit more comfortable. Like, okay, I got that out of the way. They know I can do that now.
Correct.
Right? They know that I can be a multi-platinum
And I'll even
artist.
give him a few when we go in to record the next project. But for this one, he has a lot of hard shit, but to push this as the single, I think it was huge. What are some of the, the highs on this album for you?
Well, for one, let's just say this is a fairly lengthy album. With that, there's going to come the ups and downs. There's a wider variance of quality in the songs. I will say, for this album to be 16 songs, there's really not that many, like, misses. Like, I think that...
Like, clear cut, like we were talking about with Jay,
exactly.
Where it's like, oh, man, X didn't really feel like he had that in him, at least in terms of reaching.
I'm not skipping much on this album, and that's not... By the way, I do think it needs to be stated, just on kind of odd. He featured Marilyn Manson on this album, and it didn't sound bad at all, right? Like, it was just kind of... X was such a dark...
I love that record, by the way. I'm glad you brought that
up.
Because
he was such a dark dude that he said, oh, well, let me go get...
Mr. Controversy himself at the time. I mean, a lot of people probably don't even know.
Marilyn Manson's so dark.
Yeah. I mean, with that song, X loves keeping continuity with his projects, and even though this was only a second album, you could see certain trends that he was going to carry on with his subsequent albums. Obviously, like the Damien and the Omen series. This is, and for those that don't know, if you haven't heard any of these DMX songs, this is almost, the devil on the shoulder telling X, hey, do this, do this, do this. And X, going back and forth with himself trying to fight that. I think that this is my favorite and the best version of all of those songs that he ended up doing.
I agree with that. And what makes it so real is that it is so real. Is that, there's been artists who, they can sort of create a theme or a character like that, and it's just a cool concept. This was X literally
his duality, and you could
this
feel
was
that.
that.
Right.
Like that's what makes it so real, and that's why, we say like X is the most introspective artist to me that there's ever been, because he really is letting you know 100% like this is the shit that goes on in my head. I am constantly fighting with those two sides of me, because you talk about contrast, like, yeah, X had those problems. He had the drug problems. He got in legal trouble before.
As a result,
the
right.
things that, happened before he ever blew up that he talked about, right? Where he was out there getting it. He was living a certain lifestyle. But the other side of that dude, anybody who ever knew him would tell you, like, nobody loved harder than him.
Right.
Nobody had sort of a better
Just go watch any one of his interviews and you can
exactly
see that.
like he always maintained through it all this kind of childlike innocence, and he always had this light about him that, no matter how dark it got, and it did get extremely dark, he always had this light about him, right? So that's what makes these songs like The Omen and that series so real. Is like, this shit isn't just some made up character. It's like, no, this is what I'm feeling. I'm
Right.
putting it on paper.
He wrote
right?
that from a place of like, I'm leaning this way or that way,
Exactly.
and it could go either way.
On any given day, right? So as far as some of my favorite tracks on the album go, obviously The Omen, Slippin'. I enjoy Blackout quite a bit. I mean,
I love that song, man.
These two songs are not two songs, but two artists. Jay-Z's on that, and you can hear really the best of both of the people we're talking about on the same song right here. X and Jay a few times have shown you that, right? So
that's a Swiss Beats record that I thoroughly enjoy, by the
Absolutely.
way. Like, that's one of those ones where I feel like he got that bounce, and it doesn't sound supremely outdated to me. It's one of those ones you could throw on right now, and you're still going to bob your head because everybody's coming through.
Ain't No Way is another one that I this album to me is just so I can front to back listen to this album,
Right.
and I feel like it's like a audio book, like I'm not really gonna skip anything because I just want to hear all of it, right? He has so much
Hear
to
what he
say.
has to say, right?
What about for you?
Yeah, I love Blackout. Slippin', obviously. Obviously, we discussed The Omen. One of my favorite songs, and I did want to bring this up because there's some interesting nuggets within it, is We Don't Give a Fuck, featuring Styles P and Jadakiss. And what I find interesting about this song, I love it. I think it's a great record. It's produced by Irv Gotti, okay? Irv Gotti, I think more than anyone, and X has said as much, was probably the most instrumental in him getting a deal at Def Jam.
He was the A&R.
He was
at
the A&R,
time.
and he fought hard to get X signed to the label, and then X took off running. But around this time, remember, this is late 98, Irv's protege is Ja Rule, who comes out, and a lot of people are like, oh, man, they heard DMX, and they're just ushering out the next one.
Yep.
And to be honest, for a lot of people, it was
At
that.
first, it was.
I don't have a gripe with anybody complaining that he was an X knockoff at that time. But going back to the song, We Don't Give a Fuck, I find it interesting because DMX and Ja were close. They had done records together. We're in the early stages of them attempting to form the Murder Inc. rap group, which is Jay-Z, DMX, and Ja Rule. And a lot of people think Murder Inc., you think of Ashanti and the Ja hits, but this was supposed to be a hip-hop trio, supergroup, that was going to do what the firm could not. But DMX being as
and
cool,
would have, for the record.
would have. DMX being as cool as he was with Ja, disses him on this song and had no problem admitting it years later. Used to be my dog, you was in my left titty, scream ride or die, I thought you would ride with me. And, you know, I find it so funny that X had felt that way the whole time and didn't really wait until, you know, Ja had dropped 4 albums to really start a beef with him.
Yeah.
But the song is hard. I love Bring Your Whole Crew. I think that's a good, like, it's not the Rough Riders anthem, but I do think it's an upbeat track that you could definitely throw on when you're in the gym. Again, X's lyricism all throughout is
feels like
poignant.
a song that New Yorkers can fight to.
Yeah.
I hear some shit like that, and I'm just picturing them like
stomp you out with my Timbs.
Yeah, and dusty ass Timbs just
Yeah.
meeting up in some alleyway, beating the hell out of each other, and then going to get dinner somewhere or something.
I'm glad that you mentioned that it feels like a cohesive project, because I do agree. I'll go on record to say that this is probably my favorite DMX album for that reason. I feel like you can play, even though, you know, we have qualms about Swizz's production, it is one of those albums where it's 16 songs. Most of them are close to 4 or 5 minutes, but you can kind of just let it ride all the way through, and I don't know if he has another project that's quite like that. So really, I just enjoyed the whole album. I would say that this is probably my favorite DMX album.
I got it at number 2. You know, it's dark and hell is hot. His first 3 albums to me are all great. Like, it's, you know, X just went on a crazy run right out the gate. His step onto the scene may have not been quite as hard as Snoop and 50, but it's just that level right up
tier
under it.
Right beneath it. Yeah.
Right up under. Very few people have touched that tier even, right? So between
let's put them head to head then, because I mean, from what we've been talking about, it sounds like we both really love elements of both projects. There are things that we don't particularly like with each one, and I mean, so let's start with flow. I mean, in terms of, again, not as MCs, we're talking these 2 projects. Who would you give the edge to between X on Flesh of My Flesh and J on Volume 1?
If we're talking about the artist flow, then that Jay wins that kind of easily, and no disrespect to X. That's just because Jay is beating, to me, anyone not named Big when it comes to just
on this
flowing
particular
like
album,
that.
though.
Yeah, I mean, because he displayed it right on the highs of this album. It's like, oh shit, that right there. If he could do that more often, right, which he eventually did. If you're talking about the way the album flows, I'm giving that to X. Even though Swiss's production is not my favorite, I think that X did such a great job
just elevating some of those tracks
and having everything feel so cohesive.
Yeah, tightly knit.
It really did feel like he was just writing a book, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but between the 2, it's kind of hard to compare, because I would say in my lifetime, there's a lot of this,
right,
up and down,
the roller coaster,
but that up goes way up,
right,
and that down goes way down, right? It's literally some of the best he ever made and some of the worst he ever made.
I agree.
For X,
it's a little bit more even keeled throughout.
I was super even.
Steady.
I would say it's a very steady ride, right? There's not a lot of turbulence, and it's some of the best he ever made. Not to mention, if you get into other people being on the album, I mean, you're not really going to beat the Locks being on the, and just bringing in, like, hey, let me bring Marilyn Manson in here, and the shit sounds perfect, right? Like, to me, I'm gonna have to say Flesh of My Flesh is edging out in my lifetime.
Slight
Even if
edge.
it's not reaching those highs, man, I can feel different on any given day. The way I feel right now is not that close.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to disagree, man. I think Volume 1, it's just the highs are so high. And to be fully transparent, I think I like Jay more than X just as a rapper. I mean, that's not any knock on X. I mean, we're talking about
That's
Jay-Z.
not a crazy thing to think.
But to me, the Volume 1, it was just like, whoa, okay. there were so many records that I find myself, the replay value with this album is kind of what separates the two. And this is the reason I'm going with Volume 1. I think that the production, even though, the singles are what they are, DJ Premier and the people that contributed to this project, it gives it more, it's aged better to me than a lot of the Swiss sounds. And I'm not putting all of that on X and saying that, oh, I only like this because Swiss Beats production is not my cup of tea. No, it's more or less just like what do I find myself going back and listening to more often? And for me, it's easily Volume 1. But again, I have this is my favorite DMX album. It's just, I don't know if any of X's projects ever truly surpassed like the highs of J's to me.
I agree with that. I would say this is the highest level of a J album that X can beat for me.
Okay.
Like, that's about where it is right there.
So even though it's an apples and oranges comparison in terms of their approach to each project,
very different.
X's catalog, the best of his, it's going to go up with like J's second
level.
tier. And then and it'll edge out your Volume 1s or 444, whatever you have there, the Black Album.
If we get in, because once we get into Blueprint or even Reasonable Doubt, like,
it's hard, man. It's hard to put any. For me, it's hard to put any.
X's best isn't really touching that, but it's also so different.
Yeah,
it's also just entirely different. It depends what you're looking for, But I do give the edge to Flesh of My Flesh.
All right, Frank is rolling with DMX. I am rolling with Jigga on this episode. Please let me know what you guys think, and we'll be sure to be back with another episode next week. See you.
Be back and let us know how you really feel. Subscribe, rate, review, and we'll see you next week.